Hi, my name is Greg Kobola. Today I'm going to be talking about how to describe and derive dynamic semantics. Okay. So I'm going to start out by running through uh, some issues that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by talking about what dynamics is. I'm going to talk about what modularity is. The title of the talk is Modular Dynamics. It's intended to be a way of deriving dynamic phenomena from static phenomena in a regular and simple way. I'll talk about, in order to describe modularity, I'll need to talk about semantic parts, and then we'll run through some formal details in this overview section, just because we're going to hit on that over and over again in the talk, and it's useful to have seen it up front. Okay. All right, so one intuition that I think is very common and very natural, probably because it's true in some sense, is that in a discourse, a sentence uttered in a discourse is going to change something. It's going to change the context in which the discourse participants find themselves. This will then affect the way we interpret other sentences. Right? Some words are context dependent. If I talk about being round or being flat, and I'm in a physics laboratory, then probably the word flat is going to be interpreted as really flat. But if I'm in a, I don't know, woodwork shop or well, maybe not a woodwork shop, but if I'm in a children's art room and I ask for a flat table, probably my request for a flat table is going to be understood a little more leniently than it would be if I were a physicist desperately in need of something really and truly flat. Okay. So the setting that we find ourselves in is going to influence the way we interpret words, sentences, etc. And it seems that sentences themselves can build up or modify a context in which we then interpret later sentences. Okay? A very, very simple example of this is on the slide. John owns a donkey, a sentence I just uttered, and if the next sentence is he beats it, well, this it, and this he, really, can be taken to somehow refer back to a discourse referent introduced by a donkey. Right? This discourse referent wasn't there before I said the sentence, John owns a donkey. Right? I could have used the sentence, he beats it, but without a donkey being somehow salient, I would have had to point to get my meaning across. He beats it. Okay? Once I've said John owns a donkey, I've changed the context for the upcoming sentences in the discourse in, among other ways, introducing a donkey thing that I can refer back to with the pronoun. Okay? This is a dynamic phenomenon. It's a dynamic conception of discourse, of sentences, of meaning. Okay? And this observation and observations like it have led to a debate about what the meaning of a sentence should be taken to be. What should we as semanticists be trying to do when we describe the meanings of sentences? There are many options, the two most prominent of which are you could be classical semanticists, static semanticists, and say that in order to give an appropriate characterization of the meaning of a sentence, we want to describe its truth conditions, the conditions under which this sentence is true. Okay? Taking a more dynamic perspective, we might say, no, 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 no. Truth conditions are not enough to account for the context influencing behavior of sentences. Instead, the semanticist needs to describe the context change potential of a sentence, what this sentence does on contexts. Okay? These are two different perspectives, theories, about what the meaning of a sentence should be. Okay? Now it's, I think, useful, it's important for me at this point to clarify. It's not as though the static semanticists would say, oh, there is no dynamic data, right? The data that we presented earlier, that we saw earlier about a discourse referent being introduced by the indefinite a donkey, that's not up for discussion. Clearly, that's what happens, right? We just saw it. That's the truth. What's at issue here is the right way to describe that, to formally account for it. A static semanticist might say, well, we want to account for the truth conditions of a sentence and the context change potential of a sentence. We're going to derive from the truth conditions of a sentence somehow. We're going to derive them pragmatically. They're going to be a pragmatic effect. Okay? This is what philosophers or linguists like Karen Lewis might say. A dynamic semanticist might say, no, the context change potential of a sentence is its semantic value. We don't need truth conditions. All we need are context change potentials, and we can describe them directly. We don't need to jump through hoops describing them indirectly, appealing to pragmatics or whatnot. This is semantics. Semantics describes the context change potential of sentences. Okay? And this is something that I might attribute to Hans Kamp, Irina Heim, Grondijk, and Stockhoff. I don't know if they still believe these things, but they were the ones that were very instrumental in developing dynamic semantics. Okay? All right, and so this is a debate. How should we best account for the dynamic behavior of sentences? Or perhaps better, how should we best account for dynamic phenomena? Okay. So the advantage of the static perspective is that we have a really well-developed understanding of how to assign truth conditions to sentences compositionality. We're really good at that. Okay? Perhaps just because we've been doing it longer than we've been assigning context change potentials to sentences. Okay? But of course, the disadvantage of the static perspective is that it isn't obvious how to derive the context change potential of sentences from their static truth conditions. It's just not clear. Okay? They're different suggestions, and they're interesting, and I haven't studied them enough to be able to say definitively exactly where they break down. But it's just not really clear how to do it. Okay? All right, so that's the overview for dynamics. Next, I want to talk about modularity, because I'm going to present here an approach to dynamics that builds them up out of their static meaning. Okay, I'm going to derive dynamics in some sense from staticity. But what I want to do here is to do this as part of a bigger project of viewing semantics as made up out of smaller pieces. Okay? There are lots of things going on in semantics, as we'll see on an upcoming slide. There are a lot of different semantic phenomena, a lot of almost natural classes of semantic phenomena. How do they relate to each other? How do we incorporate them all in a big semantic theory? Do we just have to do it all at once? Or can we approach it in a more modular way? Can we say, I'm only going to look at this one semantic phenomena, but that's okay because when I've finished analyzing it, I can incorporate it into the bigger picture in a regular and systematic way. Okay, so this latter is what I would like to do. And I think that it's very similar to linguists' practice. Okay, but what is modularity? So modularity is an approach to understanding complex phenomena. So if you have a complex phenomenon, there are a couple of different ways you could try to understand it. One is to just try to understand it in its complex entirety. But another way, a more practical way, especially as it gets more and more complex, exceeding the limitations of our mind's ability to, grope it as a whole, we can factor a complex phenomenon into simpler parts. We want to analyze these parts and then combine the analyses of these individual parts together to get an analysis of the whole. Okay, that's a modular approach to complex phenomena. And this kind of modular approach to complex phenomena is, perhaps what we call science. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. So linguistics, there's a complex phenomenon there, right? It's our ability to use language. That's really complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Okay? Even within the domain of linguistics proper, right? Just competence grammar type stuff, no sociolinguistics, none of the interesting stuff on the borders of linguistics, just grammar. We don't want to analyze grammar as a whole because it seems as though it's made up of smaller, internally coherent, interacting parts. Right? So I just wrote some of them in the slides. There's phonetics, there's phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics. All of these things, none of these things is grammar in and of itself. But each of these things is internally coherent. It can be analyzed as an object in its own right. And we can plug the analyses of these objects together to get the analysis of grammar, right? To be able to understand in principle which forms go together with which meanings in speech. That's what we do. Okay? So linguistics and the subdivisions of linguistics, that's an instance of us using modular analysis to understand a complex phenomenon. Okay. Now, even within these domains, even within syntax, even within morphology, even within phonology, we can ask ourselves, have we decomposed enough? Are there other smaller domains inside here? And there's no obvious way to resolve this question other than to look and see if anything jumps out at you. Okay? But here's a sentence, a complex sentence. Had a politician pushed the issue, he would have been arrested, right? There's a lot going on in that sentence, right? So we might say there's argument structure that we have to worry about. There's scope facts. There's intentionality because we're talking about what would have happened. There's dynamics because there's an indefinite is setting up a discourse referent for a later pronoun to access. There's context sensitivity. We have pronouns. There's tense. There's complex tense going on. Remember, we're not talking about the present. There's all sorts of different things taking place in this sentence. Different semantic areas, subfields, subphenomena that are instantiated in this sentence. And one question is, should we approach the understanding of these different semantic properties, sub-areas, as we approach the understanding of linguistics by looking at them individually, by trying to understand some sort of systematicity internal to these domains, and then to plug them back together? Or do we need to analyze everything at once. What do we need to do? How do we do it? I think linguistic practice is that we want to actually analyze them individually. We want to analyze them separately. By and large, my impression is that we think that these things don't really interact with each other in major ways, right? It's not that in order to describe intentionality, we have to be fully committed to a particular theory of scope, and that theory of scope interacts with the theory of intentionality in a fundamental way, such that you can't describe scope without also talking about intentionality. It doesn't seem like that's the case. So, now I want to talk about semantic parts. I sort of set up a list of semantic parts, but now I'd like to talk about them a little bit more, in a little more concrete way. Okay. What are semantic parts? Well, we can think of semantic objects as lambda terms. Why would we think of them that way? Well, because the lambda calculus is a very useful representation language that gets used a lot in linguistics, okay, and elsewhere. A part, right, a sort of a semantic part. Let me back up a bit. If a semantic object is a lambda term, and we want to investigate these different semantic domains, semantic parts, independently of each other, and then combine this investigation together somehow, what we're going to have at various points in time are just some parts having been investigated and combined together. And what we would like to do still is, have a semantic representation that takes those parts into account. Okay? And imagine we had that. And then someone finishes their part and wants to combine it with what we have. Okay? Well, that means that our semantic representation is somehow going to have to be updated to take into account what they discovered studying their semantic part. Okay? So their part is going to have to tell us how we need to update our semantic representation so that it reflects what they discovered. So let's look at this in, let's take one more step towards concreteness, and let's look at intentionality, okay? Spelling. Look at intentionality. So in intentionality, we're talking about possible worlds. Okay? We're talking about the ways things could have been or might be. Okay? And we typically, when we're talking about the semantics of sentences, if these sentences don't evince any intentional properties or phenomena, we typically ignore that. We typically say, okay, let's just leave it aside. Let's leave possible worlds aside. We don't need to understand them or to talk about them to describe the meaning of this sentence. Okay? But what we're going to do when we give our extensional semantics, we're going to expect that when we're done understanding intentionality, we then come back and add it in. First of all, we can add it into what we've done. And it's going to have to turn the non-intentional meanings that we came up with into intentional meanings. Okay? So here's an example of that. This is an example that Makoto Kanazawa and Philippe de Groote worked on. It's actually from the paper, or it's an adaptation of what they did in the paper. So if we have an extensional semantics, or an extensional meaning representation, no student can laugh, okay? And we want to intentionalize it. Well, what we should get back is something like below on the slide. We should get back something that is intentional. It makes reference to possible worlds. Instead of just being a true in a model, it is a function from worlds to truth values in a model. So this previous sentence was something like, no student has the property that they are able to laugh. In the below the intentionalized meaning, which we would like to happen automatically, we have a function from possible worlds to the following truth value that is going to be true just in case nothing which is a student in that world has the property that there is an accessible world in which in that world they laugh. Okay, it's not really changing much, but that's what we would like to do. Okay, so as a recipe, we want to identify a semantic domain. We're going to need to specify certain meanings as certain words, word meanings, as this word meaning, it is special because it relies on this domain. For example, here, the word can in the previous sentence was just, what is the meaning of can? Well, typically we use intentionality, possible worlds, to describe the meaning of can. But here we didn't have possible worlds yet. So we just had a constant. Once we introduced possible worlds, well, most things didn't change much. Student, well, it became, instead of just a property of individuals, it's a relation between individuals and possible worlds. Similarly with laugh. But can's meaning is intrinsically intentional, right? Where can says there is a world that's accessible from the present one in which my complement obtains. Okay? That's what can means. So can's meaning is unpredictable. We can't just say, oh, here's this constant can, let's just intentionalize it in whatever way. No, can has a special meaning that can only really be described in the domain of intentionality. Okay? So there are going to be some non-predictable meanings, and those are the meanings of the things which can only be described in this domain that we're looking at. But most things, most words, don't really interact with these different domains, right? The noun students doesn't really require reference to possible worlds to give an account of the meaning of student. Similarly with laugh. Laugh doesn't really need to take possible worlds into account to give meanings for. Okay? And most words are going to be, given any domain, are just going to be needing to be changed to allow information, to allow the richer domain to flow through them and get to where it needs to go. Okay, this is very vague right now, but we'll see how this works out. Now, this can only work if things are compositional, right? I can only have a recipe to update my previous representation if the way things are put together is compositional. If the meaning that I want to have is related to the meanings of the parts in a systematic way. Okay? So here's how this is going to work, right? Here's now, so I said that we want, in order to deal with modularity, semantic modularity, we're going to want to investigate semantic domains by themselves and then update what we have, our representation, so that they then take those structures of those domains that we just investigated into account. Okay? Now here's how I want to do that. So I want to use a lambda homomorphism. So first let me say really quickly what a homomorphism is. I'm going to talk about homomorphisms of strings, of trees, and then we're going to generalize it to lambda terms. So if you have a string, just a word, a sequence of letters, what you can do is you can systematically say, I'm going to change all the A's in my word to the string of letters XYZ. And so you just walk through your word, and every time you see an A, you take it out and replace it with XYZ. Okay? So ABBA, the band name ABBA, would change to XYZ BB XYZ. I just replaced the two A's with XYZ. Okay? That's a homomorphism. I'm replacing basic pieces with more complicated things. Okay? Now I can do the same thing with a tree, right? So a tree, we can think of it as a two-dimensional string, right? Or we can think of it as a string where there can be multiple daughters, where there can be multiple next letters, right? But maybe we should just think of it as a tree in the top-down way the linguists are used to, right? The upside-down way. So the leaves are on the bottom and the root is on the top. Okay? So the basic parts of trees, the atomic parts of trees, are the nodes, the symbols. And symbols in strings, symbols have at most one thing following them and at most one thing preceding them. Okay? But in a tree, a symbol can have at most one thing above it, but it can have lots of things below it. It has one parent, but could have multiple children. Okay? So we're going to try to use the same idea on a tree that we used on a string. We want to replace a simple symbol with an object, a complicated object, so that we get something of the same kind back. So with a string, we have a string and we want to get a string back. So we replace a letter with a string. Now a tree, we have a tree. We want to replace a node with something and get a tree back. How do we do it? Well, if we take a node out, it's going to have some number of daughters. So each of those daughters should be put back somehow. Where can they be put back into? Well, if we had a tree that was missing that many daughters, then those daughters would have a home. And we could plug that tree back where we took that node out from. Okay? So in a tree, you replace a symbol with k daughters by a tree with k empty positions. And then you get a tree back. That's a tree homomorphism. In a lambda term is like a tree, except that instead of just having atomic arguments, the arguments that you can have, your daughters, can be arbitrarily complex terms of arbitrarily complex type. Okay? So you take a symbol that has a type, and you want to replace it with a term that has a similar type. Okay? That's what a lambda homomorphism is. So here's an example. If we have a lambda term, it has a type. So here, every kitten, we typically analyze that as a generalized quantifier of type E arrow T, arrow T. So it's something that wants a property and will give you back a truth value. But what we want to do is we want to replace or refine, update this simple expression, every kitten, into a more complicated one, maybe by intentionalizing it or doing something to it. Okay? And this complicated expression is written by having a line over the simple expression, right? So every kitten without the line is just the normal every kitten. Every kitten with the line is the more complicated, updated version. What is it? I don't know. It's complicated and updated. Okay? And its type is also presumably going to become more complicated, more updated. And I'm representing that by also putting a line above its type. Okay? But in order to do this systematically, we want to do it compositionally. We want to say that the way to replace or to update every kitten is by updating every, updating kitten, and putting them together. Okay? Just like the way to build every kitten was by taking every and taking kitten and putting them together, the way to update every kitten is by updating every, updating kitten, and having them put together. Okay? Similarly, the way we want to update the type is compositionally. We update a type by simply updating all of the atomic types it contains. Okay? That's what we want to do. That's our notion of updating. Okay. Now, how does this work exactly? Well, we have a type homomorphism. Now, a homomorphism replaces, in a complicated structure, the tiny pieces with other things. So to give a homomorphism, we need to describe what it does on the tiny pieces, and then we have to explain how it goes into big things and replaces tiny pieces. So this little h is our type homomorphism. We need to tell it now what it's going to do on tiny pieces. So on a tiny piece C, say, it's going to change it to a type alpha. I don't care what alpha is. Okay? And then, if we have a big type, how do we replace the pieces in it? Well, we do it compositionally. If our big type is actually just an atomic type, we say, hey, homomorphism, come here, you know what to do. If our complicated type is actually an implication, is actually an arrow between two types, then we say, aha, I'm going to keep the arrow, I'm going to keep the same structure, but I'm going to replace the left and right hand types with whatever they need to be replaced by. Okay? So if we look at intensional semantics again, the idea there is that what we want to do is we want to make our atomic types world dependent. Okay? So we want to take possible worlds into consideration. So we don't just have individuals, rather we have world-dependent individuals. We don't just have truth values, we have world-dependent truth values. A sentence isn't just true or false, it's true or false depending on which world we're looking at. And this depending on is cashed out in type theory as a function type, as a S arrow something. S is the type of possible worlds. Okay? So the translation of E arrow T, which is not what we were looking at before, but it is a reasonable type nonetheless, is the translation of E, arrow the translation of E, arrow the translation of T. And the translation of E is a world-dependent E, and we had two of those. And the translation of T is a world-dependent T. Okay? So that's how we're going to systematically update our types. Same thing in the world of lambda terms. We specify what each constant abbreviates, how we want to unpack or view or refine or update each constant. And then we look at a big lambda term and we just say, okay, where are the constants in here? I'm going to keep everything else the same. I'm just going to change the constants. Okay? So this line here, for example, says the way to update the application term of m applied to n is just to keep the application there, but update m and update n. The way to implement or to update an abstraction, lambda xm, is by keeping the abstraction lambda x and then just updating the m. Okay? So you keep the structure of what you had, and all you do is you replace the constants with their new definitions. Okay? Now, because we're working with typed lambda term, and the type of a constant or a term describes to you where it can appear, how it can interact with other things, if we update something, if we're updating everything, if we're updating all the pieces of something, we're also updating their types. Okay? And in order to make sure that everything fits together as it did before, if we replace a constant with something, the thing that we replace it with has to have the right kind of type. Otherwise, it might not fit there. Okay? So when we replace a constant of a particular type, we have to replace it with a term of a homomorphic type, of a similar type. Okay? This notion of a lambda homomorphism was introduced by Philippe de Groote in this context, in the context of giving us a way of understanding dynamic semantics. Okay? So, what I want to do, and that was the lead up, what I want to do here is the following. I want to analyze context sensitivity, including dynamic binding, okay, including the ability for sentences to change the discourse context in such a way that pronouns in upcoming or in later sentences can refer back to discourse reference that they introduced. And I want to do this by viewing dynamic context sensitivity as actually two independent semantic domains. A semantic domain, which I'll call con for context sensitivity, that is solely responsible for adding context sensitivity to semantic representations, and a domain that I'll call din for dynamic, which is solely responsible for introducing or implementing dynamicity. I wrote dynamicity with static in parentheses in front of it, which seems sort of a misnomer or a contradiction. What I mean here is that it's not going to be talking about pronouns or anything like this. We're not really going to be updating context in any sense. Okay. At the very end, I have some slides where I'm going to talk about dynamic Montague grammar. Okay, so dynamic Montague grammar is, in my mind, the preeminent dynamic semantic paradigm today. And what I'm going to be doing here is following Philippe de Groote's work, different from what you do in dynamic Montague grammar. Both what I do here and what we're going to see at the very end when I talk about dynamic Montague grammar have a similar effect, right? We can account for dynamic phenomena, but it's done in very different ways. Okay? And I'll also, while I'm talking about static dynamicity, I'll talk about theories of discourse, theories of rhetorical relations, discourse relations, okay? Very briefly. Okay, so this is the outline of this talk. So I just went through the overview. We're done with that. I'm going to start out by talking about dynamics. Then I'll turn to context sensitivity. And I'll formulate each of these discussions as culminating in a module, a modular description of this kind of phenomenon. Okay, and then I'll talk about putting it all together. I'll summarize, and then I'll talk about true dynamics, dynamic Montague grammar. Okay, and we'll see what the difference is between what I did here and dynamic Montague grammar, which I'll also formulate as a module. Okay, dynamics. So I'm going to talk about discourse, how to modularize dynamics, I'll give you an example, and then I'll talk about discourse structure or rhetorical relations. Okay. So, it seems to be the case that sentences can set up discourse references for other sentences. As we saw at the beginning, John owns a donkey, period, new sentence, he beats it, aha, the first sentence introduced a discourse reference for the second sentence, changed the context so that the second sentence could be interpreted in such a way as to be talking about a donkey. Okay? Now, I'm going to model this as scope. And the reason I'm going to model it as scope is because that is the way that we describe binding. Binding implicates scope because binding is modeled in the lambda calculus with the lambda abstraction construction. Okay? And lambda abstraction implements binding. When linguists talk about binding, semanticists talk about binding, they mean essentially, I understand it as saying that we have an operator and it takes as its argument something that is a lambda abstraction. And thus it binds everything that the lambda abstraction in its argument binds. Okay? So if I'm very naively going to continue using the word binding, so the pronoun binds an antecedent, or the pronoun is bound by, the variable introduced by the pronoun is bound by the existential quantifier, I can only do this if the second sentence is inside the scope, is under the scope of the existential quantifier. That's the only way I have available for me of doing this. Okay? Now, if you were a Montague, a dynamic Montague grammarian, you might object and say, no, but we don't need to do that. When I reconstruct the theory of dynamic Montague grammar, we can decide whether that's the case. Okay? But here, I'm going to model all of this as scope. Okay? And so as in 1 and 2, the philosophy, the basic observation will be the following. Given two sentences, sentence 1 S and sentence 2 T, where T follows S, if T can access discourse reference introduced by S, I'm going to model this by saying that T is in the scope of S, as in 1. If it cannot, then I'm going to say they're not in each other's scopes. Okay, and I'll model this sort of conjunctively. Those are the two options for sentences in a discourse. They can either, a subsequent sentence can either pick up a discourse referent introduced in the first sentence, in which case I'll model it as in 1 as being in the scope of the first sentence, or not, in which case I'll model it as in 2 as not being in the scope of the first sentence. Okay? You might think, how do sentences scope? We're not there yet. I've just committed myself to doing this because if I want to model pronouns as being somehow bound by their antecedents, I have to have a notion of sentence scope here. Okay? So the primitive notion that we're going to be working with is sentence scope. This is the fundamental object of study in dynamics, as I'll outline it here. Okay? Now, it's motivated by context sensitivity, by discourse referent accessibility. And it's motivated by this. That's how I decide whether one sentence scopes over the other or not. That's how I decide it. But it's formally independent of that, right? I just said, yes, sentence 1, I will make scope over sentence 2 if sentence 2 has a pronoun that accesses a discourse reference set up in sentence 1. But in order to describe that, I don't have to even say how to analyze pronouns. I don't even have to talk about discourse reference in my theory. Right? So sentence scope is what I'm going to study here. And I'm going to ignore, formally, context sensitivity. Okay? So sentences are interpreted in discourse, and the context grows throughout the discourse. And so I'm going to say that sentences in a discourse just scope over each other. That's how basically discourses function at this point in time. Okay? If I have two sentences, pronouns in the second sentence can, in fact, pick up antecedents in the previous sentence. And so, yeah, in general, that's how I'm going to want to structure a discourse. Having the first sentence scope over the second sentence. Note that this gives me a new structure that can then scope over a subsequent sentence. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, sentences can set up discourse references for other sentences, not just across sentences, but also within sentences. Okay? So I can have sentences made up of smaller sentences, like with sentence level conjunction or implication. John owns a donkey. Here's our a donkey. And I'm conjoining two sentences. He beats it again. A donkey introduces a discourse referent or sets up a discourse referent that it is able to access. If John owns a donkey, here's our a donkey, then he beats it. It refers back to a donkey. Okay. Now here we aren't looking at across sentence boundaries, across periods. We're looking within sentences. Okay. Now, if we're looking within sentences, we're doing this because we have sentential connectives, and, or, not, if, then, so on and so forth. But they don't all behave the same. Okay, so here's a little typology of sentence connectives, or classification of sentence connectives. And I wrote internal and external. Internal means, and I wrote is yes internal. It's internally dynamic because inside of it, it's two argument sentences. The two argument sentences to and scope over each other, or the first one scopes over the second. That's why it's internally dynamic, because its two arguments are scopally related. Similarly, if then is internally dynamic because its two arguments are scopally related. The antecedent needs to scope over the consequent. Okay? External dynamicity means across sentence boundaries. So if I have a period after a sentence with main connective and, can what comes up after that and access discourse reference in the and sentence? And the answer is yes. That's what I'm calling externally dynamic. And is externally dynamic. These other connectives are not. Okay. If then is internally dynamic, or is not. And not is not, interestingly, doesn't make sense to ask the question because not only has one sentence as its argument. Okay. But and is exceptionally externally dynamic compared to the other sentence, compared to the other connectives, and is special. And if then are internally dynamic as well, in contrast to or. Okay. So that's just sort of, those are just observations. And now the question comes, how do we account for them? Okay. How do we want to update our non-dynamic semantics, a semantics where we aren't even considering scoping over other sentences, to one where we do? How do we do that? Okay. So the first step is to ask, what's going on at the type level? The types don't tell us everything about the lambda terms, but they do tell us some things about the lambda terms. So often it's worthwhile formulating our intuitions at the level of types, see how they would be realized here, and then we can work them out concretely over terms. Okay? So how we want to update our non-dynamic system is we want to allow sentences to take arguments. We want to have sentences take scope over things. Okay? And we don't really want to change normal individual denoting expressions, right? They're not changing anything there. They're not doing anything extra with scope now. We're really only focusing on sentences taking other sentences as their arguments. Okay. So how do we model that? Well, we model that by saying the type E doesn't change. It stays E when we update it. The type T, however, does change. The type T needs to be updated so that it becomes a function. It's a function that wants to take something of type T as an argument, and then it will be itself something of type T. Okay? And we want to do this because we want, again, sentences to be able to scope over things, to take arguments. Okay? They're going to take discourses as arguments, if you will. Okay? So that's what we want. That's what we want at the type level. And now we need to remember, now we need to formulate exceptions. Because in order to formulate the transformation or the updating scheme at the level of terms, we need to say what we need to do for the exceptional terms, the terms that behave specially here in this updating world. And then we need to give a general recipe for how to update everyone else. Okay? So the ones that are special are these four. And is special because it's internally and externally dynamic. If then is special because it's internally dynamic. Some is a special determiner because it too is internally and externally dynamic. Why is it externally dynamic? Because some, the indefinite article, is the guy that is introducing these discourse references that go over sentence boundaries. Right? He's somehow the problem that motivated this entire discussion. Okay? But determiners in general are internally dynamic. Okay? A determiner can allow discourse reference from its restrictor argument to be visible to its scope argument. So every boy who owns a donkey beats it. Okay? So determiners in general are internally dynamic. Okay? So I'm going to break the recipe for how to update a non-dynamic term into a dynamic term in two steps. I'm going to first account for internal dynamicity, exceptional internal dynamicity, and then I'll account for exceptional external dynamicity. And then I'll just give a general recipe for dealing with everything else, things that are just not dynamic. Okay? So, inherent internal dynamicity. So determiners have a property. They're conservative. They're also strong or weak in the literature in many different ways. Here, when we're talking about donkey sentences, every farmer who owns a donkey beats it, there are often two readings that we can get here. One reading is the strong reading, which says every farmer who owns a donkey beats every donkey that he owns. Okay, I think that's the most natural reading for the sentence, every farmer who owns a donkey. But there's also another reading that's not so easy here, but if we change it to everyone who has a coin puts it in the parking meter, there it's perhaps more natural to understand that as everyone who has a coin puts a coin, just one of them, in the parking meter. You don't need to put all of your life savings in the parking meter for that sentence to be true. Okay? Or everyone who had a coin put it in the parking meter. Okay? I can say that if most people had money and everyone that had money actually paid for parking. But that doesn't require that everyone put all of their money in the parking meter. Okay? That's the weak reading of the donkey sentence. In order to model both of these things, I'm going to just assume, for the sake of modeling, that there are two kinds of determiners. There's strong determiners and weak determiners, which means really that every determiner has two copies of itself in the lexicon, a strong copy and a weak copy. Maybe there's a better way of doing this. Ideally, there would be a better way of doing this. But right now, we're just going to do it like that. It's simple, quick and dirty, and being modular. Okay? So a strong determiner and a weak determiner are going to take advantage of conservativity, which is a property that determiners in natural languages have. And this is a semantic property, and it says that any determiner or every determiner only cares about certain elements that its scope argument are true of. So the scope argument of a determiner is its second argument. So in every boy smiled, smiled is the scope argument, boy is the restrictor argument. And it's called the restrictor argument because it restricts the scope. For every boy smiled, I don't care about non-boys that smile, right? If I say every boy smiled, is that true? And you start trotting out girls, I say, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not talking about, I said every boy smiled. Why are you showing me girls? They're irrelevant for the purposes of evaluating whether or not every boy smiled. Okay? So quantified determiners only care about those members of those things who have their scope property that also have their restrictor property. Okay, this is called conservativity. And there are two ways that we can formulate that, two ways that we can modify, rewrite, update a term so that it still has the same truth conditions. Okay, one is that we can have the strong reading here, the strong interval dynamic reading here, where we say a determiner takes a P, its restrictor argument, and a Q, its scope argument, and says, I'm only interested in those, or I'm only interested in P's, and I want to verify that they have the property that if P, then Q. Okay, but if I'm only looking at P's, then of course every P has the property P, and so if it's a P, then Q, well, yeah, I'm only looking at P's in the first place. Okay, so this doesn't change the meaning. All I'm doing is changing the form, which seems like a strange thing to do, but it'll make sense in a second. Similarly, a weak determiner, I'm going to inherently dynamicize a weak determiner by saying I'm interested in things in my restrictor argument that have the property that they are in my restrictor argument and they are in my scope argument. But of course, if I'm only looking at things that already have my restrictor property, then yeah, the fact that I say again and they have to have my restrictor property doesn't change anything. So adding this P arrow or this P and to the semantic representation in the second argument doesn't change the meaning of these things, doesn't change the truth conditions of these things because they're conservative. Okay? Doesn't make sense why I'm doing this right now, but it will make sense afterwards. Similarly, I need to account or describe the internally dynamic behavior of if-then. Okay? Now we can reformulate if-then classically using and not. Right? You can define an equivalent truth function using and not. Okay? So if A then B is equivalent to it is not the case that A but not B. Okay, that's classically equivalent. So I'm going to, again, replace if then in our formal language with this not A but not B. Okay? Doing this is going to account for internal dynamicity. Okay? How does it do that, Greg? Well, I'll tell you in a sec. Right now, I'm just telling you that it does, but I haven't told you why. But what I'm doing here is I'm trying to motivate to you that this is a truth-preserving operation. I haven't done, I mean, it's sort of crazy because why would I bother? But I haven't done anything sneaky here. All I've done is replaced one constant with something that's equivalent to it. Okay. Now, some things are externally dynamic too. We're still working on the exceptions. And is externally dynamic. That means that it's going to need to take its discourse argument and scope over it. Okay? And is also internally dynamic. So this is what I'm going to change and into. Okay, now here, the and meaning has disappeared. And no longer, the truth function and, the Boolean connective and, is no longer, right? I've replaced it with function composition. Why? Well, because function composition, I have these two functions, right? Now my sentence meanings are functions, right? And I want to build a new function out of them. And I want these functions to be embedded in each other in an appropriate way, okay? Because then they scope over each other. So this formula here simply describes how I want the scope relations to obtain between the two conjuncts of and the capital phi and the capital psi, and the upcoming discourse, the lowercase psi. Okay? I want the left conjunct to scope over the right conjunct, which in turn scopes over the rest of the discourse. Okay? That the left conjunct scopes over the right conjunct is internal dynamicity, and that both of them scope over the remainder of the discourse is external dynamicity. Okay? So this term accounts for both internal and external dynamicity, for the internal external dynamic behavior of and. So that's good. But on the other hand, somehow the meaning of and, the truth function, has gone up in smoke. So don't worry, we'll get to that later. Right? All that this lambda term does is account for the dynamic properties of and. Similarly, sum, the indefinite determiner, is also externally dynamic. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, so what that means is when I have some monkey slept, and what it's going to do is it's going to introduce a discourse referent that can be accessed by sentences later on in the discourse. Okay? Now what that means, or how I'm going to implement that, is I'm going to take the later discourse as my argument, because I've updated sentences to denote functions from truth values to truth values, from propositions to propositions. I'm going to take a proposition as my argument, which is the upcoming discourse, and I'm actually going to put it in my scope. Okay? So why is sum externally dynamic? Because here we see why is wrong. How do we model that sum is externally dynamic? Because I've written a lambda term for sum that takes the upcoming discourse and puts it inside the scope argument to sum. Okay? Now, I want to have an operation. When I update my non-dynamic analysis, my non-dynamic terms, I want to do all three of these things. I want to change everything so that it's internally dynamic. Everything that's exceptionally internally dynamic, I want to change it so that it does that. So I'm going to first do the int, and then I'm going to change implication, the if-then, so that it's this funny thing out of knots and ands and knots. And then I'm going to replace all of the ands with function composition, and I'm going to replace all of the sums with that thing we just saw. Okay? Those are the three things I want to do in that order. Okay? So here are these homomorphisms. Int on my internally dynamic operator, all it does is it changes determiners. Every determiner, every strong determiner, it turns the scope into the implication between its restrictor and its scope, and every weak determiner, it turns its scope argument into the conjunction of its restrictor and its scope argument. That's what the int homomorphism does. And on everything else, everything that is neither a strong nor a weak determiner, it just leaves it as is. The implication homomorphism, only on if-then, it changes it to this funny term made up out of not and and. On every other constant, it just leaves it the same. And finally, this externally dynamic lambda homomorphism, it changes and, it changes some, and for everything else, it makes it dynamic in a default way. Okay? That's how we deal with dynamicity. Okay? Great, wonderful. We've seen almost everything, and now we just haven't seen how to make something dynamic in a default way. Okay. So, how do we do this? We do this systematically, right? Now we're dealing with the default. Now the default is we don't care. Well, I'm just a normal guy. You want me now to live in this dynamic world, whatever. But I'm just me. I'm not dynamic. Right? So you're just going to have to, tell me what to do. So we're going to do this in cases based on the type of the lambda term we're looking at. So if we have something of type E, just a normal individual denoting term, we need to turn it into something that's the translation of E. But the translation of E, the updated version of E, is also just E. So yeah, hey, we already have one. We don't need to change anything. So if I want to generically dynamicize a term of type E, I just give it right back. I'm done. I'm happy. Wonderful. I wash my hands. Everything is great. Okay. If I want to dynamicize a generic term of type T, well, now I actually change things of type T so that they're now type T arrow T. Now they're functions from Booleans to truth values. How do I do this? Well, I want to change phi into a function from T to T. So that means he's got to take an argument. Let's call it his argument psi. And that's a truth. That's a truth bearer. And phi is also a truth bearer. And I need to somehow put them together. Well, a couple of considerations. First, I lost the meaning of and, right? And so it'd be great to get it back. Second, we generally sentences in discourses combine conjunctively, right? If I say, John woke up, period, he put his clothes on, period, he went outside, that means basically the same thing as John woke up and he put his clothes on and he went outside, right? So sentences in a discourse seem like they combine with each other conjunctively. So we're going to say that we're going to turn a normal proposition into a dynamic proposition, a generic dynamic proposition, by just saying, look, you're a function. When you get your argument, just coordinate yourself with it. Okay. Finally, we need to say what we're going to do on functions. Okay, we have a function from alpha to beta, and we want to turn it into a dynamic function from dynamic alpha to dynamic beta. How do we do that? Well, we can do that if we have a way of taking something that's dynamic and turning it back to something normal. I'm going to call that staff or static. Okay, so our dynamic version of f is going to take a dynamic argument of type alpha. Okay, but f can't deal with dynamic things of type alpha. F just wants normal things of type alpha. So we turn that dynamic thing of type alpha into a normal thing of type alpha and give it to f. Okay, now f is happy at that, and he takes his normal thing of type alpha and gives us back a normal thing of type beta. But we don't want a normal thing of type beta. We want a dynamic thing of type beta. So we take the result of f applying to this static A and dynamicize it. Now what that ends up doing is it gives us a function that takes a dynamic alpha and gives us back a dynamic beta, which is just what we want. Okay? So this is how we dynamicize arbitrary things. If you have a lambda term, I'm going to dynamicize it like that. Okay? If you have a constant, I'm going to dynamicize it like that. That's what I'm going to do. Okay? But now we have to say how to statify things, how to make something static. And here's how we're going to do that. We're going to need to be able to take a dynamic thing and turn it into a normal static thing. Well, so let's take a dynamic individual. Now remember, a dynamic individual is the same thing as a normal individual. So if we take a dynamic individual, that already is a normal individual. So we just give it back. Now let's take a dynamic proposition. A dynamic proposition is of type T arrow T. All right, so now we have to take this thing of type T arrow T and give back a normal T. Well, how could we do that? We could do that if we gave it a truth value as argument. Right? Then it would have its argument and it would give us a T by itself, a truth value by itself. Which one should we give? We have two truth values. We've got true, we've got false. Well, since we're putting and as somehow the basic generic dynamic meaning, then true is the natural thing to give because true is a neutral element, an identity element for and. Okay. False is an annihilator for and. If we have and false, the result is just false. So if we here take our dynamic proposition and give it false, that's just going to destroy everything. But if we give it true, then if we started out with a normal thing, we dynamicized it, and then we're trying to statify it again, we'll get the normal thing back. Okay, so true is the truth value that makes the most sense given how we decided to dynamicize things. Okay, so I'm harping on this because there's an interplay between what we did here when we decided how to make things dynamic and what we're doing here when we decide how to make dynamic things static. And it's exactly at the type that where all the action was. Our dynamicization procedure really only cares about type T, and it dynamicizes it by making it into T arrow T. And that type is also where all the action is happening for our statification and our dynamicization transformations. Okay. Now again, we're going to want to take a dynamic function from dynamic alphas to dynamic betas and turn it into a normal static function from static alphas to static betas. How do we do that? Well, we want it to be a function from static alphas, so we give it a normal static argument. Okay? And we have our f. But f doesn't want static alphas. F wants dynamic alphas. Thankfully, we have a way of making static things into dynamic things. We just use din. So we use din to change our A into a dynamic alpha, which is the kind of thing that f wants as its argument. F takes it and gives us back a dynamic beta. But we don't want a dynamic beta, we want a static beta. So luckily we have a way of taking dynamic things and making them static. So we take the dynamic beta that f just made and we make it static. And that gives us a way of turning a dynamic function into a static function. Okay, so let's just look at what's going on here. So not. I said that not is predictable. I sort of de facto said it was predictable, how it interacts with dynamicity, because I didn't say that it was exceptional, right? So not is normal. Not is a constant of type TROT, so it's a function, right? So that means that to dynamicize it, we're going to use this, okay? And when we do that, we end up with this term, okay? Now we can already see that here we've used the special cases of statifying a dynamic proposition and dynamifying a static proposition. And we did that because when we dynamicize functions, we statify their argument and dynamicize the result. Okay? So not is a function. So we statify his argument. We make his dynamic argument now static because not wants a normal thing. And then we dynamicize the result, right? The result of doing that, we say, yeah, and then conjoin the rest of the discourse with you. Okay, that's how not works. Praise. So here we want to dynamicize the arguments and statify the result. Well, its two arguments, their dynamic versions are just themselves because its arguments are individuals. So statifying the arguments doesn't do anything. But we dynamicize the result by conjoining the rest of the discourse, the upcoming discourse, with praise XY. When we dynamicize every, okay, now when we translate every, first we're going to want to replace it with its strong or weak version. But here we're just using this din operation on every. We're going to dynamicize its arguments. No, I'm sorry. We're going to statify his arguments, which are dynamic, and we're going to dynamify the results. How do we statify the arguments? Well, his arguments are actually also functions. Okay. So we want to statify a function. How do we statify a function? Well, we statify the function by dynamicizing its arguments and statifying the result. Okay. So we're going to dynamicize his argument x, which is an individual, which stays the same, and dynamicizing the result. I'm sorry, and statifying the result. Dynamicizing the argument, statifying the result. Statifying the result of giving a property an individual argument is to statify a dynamic property, which means we're going to give it a truth value, true, which is what we do here. We do the same thing to the Q, right? We want to statify this function, and we statify a function by dynamicizing its argument and statifying the result. And then we wanted to dynamicize every himself by statifying his arguments and dynamicizing the result. Well, we just got through statifying his arguments, and now we got to dynamicize the result, and again, that works by just conjoining the rest of the discourse here. Okay. The important thing to note here is that all of these examples are externally dynamic. They're externally dynamic because when we dynamicize the result, we're just adding on the rest of the discourse, but not in the scope of what we had of the previous sentence, of the original sentence. The upcoming discourse is tacked on there not as an argument of the original sentence. Okay? And that means that the default dynamicization gives us an externally static meaning, which is good because most things are externally static. Okay. All right, let's look at an example here. So here are our constants: a, boy, jump, laugh, and he. Okay. And let's let our term be a term for the meaning of a boy jumped and he laughed. Okay, which could either be two separate sentences or it could be one sentence. Okay, a boy jumped and he laughed. When we dynamicize it in this way, we need to replace a with whatever he is. We need to replace and with composition. And we need to do this capital din on everything else. Okay? And what we get is the following. Once we've done all of that, we end up with this sentence here. Okay? So first of all, we see that we did this, we used the weak quantifier for the weak determiner for A because we used coordination here in the scope argument. But we see that first we did do that. And second, we used the special meaning of A that takes the upcoming discourse and actually puts it inside of the scope argument of A. Okay? And so we see the and laugh he actually is inside the scope argument of a boy. Okay? So this is how we're going to be able to bind pronouns in upcoming sentences, because A extends his scope in this way over future sentences. Okay, and he does it exceptionally. Every doesn't do this. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about discourse structure. So I said that discourses were built coordinatively. Okay, but people that study discourse relations and discourse structure say that that isn't the case. Isn't exactly the case. Okay, so here's an example from Nick Asher and colleagues. That's supposed to be of a natural discourse. John had a lovely evening. He had a great meal. He ate salmon. He devoured cheese. He won a dancing competition. Okay, so this is a natural discourse, and if we, it's sort of stilted, but it's a good enough discourse as far as it goes. And if we think about how the sentences relate to one another in this discourse, we see that different sentences stand in different relations to other sentences. So for example, sentence 2 and sentence 5, he had a great meal and he won a dancing competition, elaborate on the first sentence. John had a lovely evening. Right? So if I say John had a lovely evening, you might be interested in knowing how that happened. What made his evening so lovely? And I can elaborate on that by saying, oh, he had a great meal and he won a dancing competition. And these two sentences, 2 and 5, are in a narrative, right? They sort of say, this happened and then this happened. Okay? These are the two parts that combine together to elaborate, to give rise to the lovely evening. Okay? Now, sentences 3 and 4, on the other hand, are elaborations of 2. When I say, he had a great meal, you might ask, well, oh, really? Wow, tell me more about that great meal. And then I can say, oh, he had salmon and he devoured cheese. Those are the two things that I could say to elaborate on the greatness of the meal. And they then stand in sort of a narrative to one another. Right? He ate salmon and then he devoured cheese, right? I'm saying these things happened after each other. Okay? So in a discourse, there are different ways that the upcoming sentences can be related to previous sentences. Okay? And we can represent this discourse as a tree in this way. So the internal nodes are labeled with the kind of discourse relation, and the sentences are at the leaves. So I said that there was a lovely evening that was had. John had a lovely evening, and I wanted to elaborate on that. How did I elaborate on that? Well, I gave a narrative. I gave the narrative of sentence 2, he had a great meal, and sentence 5, he won a dancing competition. So the narrative of this thing had a great meal and won a dancing competition. But having a great meal wasn't just there by itself. I, in fact, elaborated on it. So before I continued with my narrative, I elaborated on having a great meal by giving a narrative of eating salmon and devouring cheese. Okay. Now, so this is interesting, and there's lots and lots of work on discourse relations, and these two that I mentioned here are just two of many. Different theories give you different numbers. But there's a generalization that people have been thinking about for a while, and it's called the right frontier constraint. And the right frontier constraint says that if you have a pronoun in your discourse, that pronoun can't just pick up arbitrary discourse reference strewn throughout the discourse, introduced throughout the discourse by arbitrary indefinites. No, no, no. Rather, it can only pick up discourse reference that are introduced by indefinites in certain sentences. Okay. So you start, so the discourse thus far is a tree, right? Here's the tree, that's the discourse thus far. If I have another sentence, I'm going to add it to the discourse. I'm going to ask, okay, now this sentence is a pronoun in it. Where can I go? Well, I start at the rightmost leaf, and I can go anywhere I want. I can wander through the tree however I want, and anywhere I go, I can pick up I can look at the discourse references that were introduced there, but I can't go down the left branch of a narrative relation. Okay, so if I start here at the winning the dancing competition, okay, I can go wherever I want, but I can't go down the left branch of my mother because it's a narrative competition. It's a narrative relation. So this elaboration subtree is blocked off to me. I can pick up discourse reference in this sentence. I can pick up discourse reference in the first sentence, but nowhere else. Okay? That's the right frontier constraint. Here's an example. If I then say, so it was nice and pink, right? John had a lovely evening, he had a great meal, he ate salmon, he devoured cheese, he won a dancing competition, it was nice and pink. What was nice and pink? Well, of course the salmon, but that doesn't work. You're not allowed to do that. And the right frontier constraint is an attempt at describing the situations in which you are allowed to pick up discourse reference. And if we look at the discourse tree here, well, we start at the left-hand daughter, the won the dancing competition, I'm sorry, the rightmost leaf, won the dancing competition, and I go anywhere I want, which is symbolized in this orange color, but not down the left branch of a narrative relation. And that just means I only have these three nodes, or this sort of spine to choose from. Okay? And that's why it was nice and pink can't access the discourse reference set up by salmon, or a great meal, or cheese. Okay. So how do we deal with that? What can we do? What sort of means do we have at our disposal to restrict the ways that discourses can combine and influence which discourse reference are available at various positions in the discourse? Well, one way of classifying discourse relations is as per whether they are subordinating or coordinating. Okay? Elaboration is a subordinating discourse relation. The narrative relation is a coordinating one. So a subordinating relation behaves like this. It behaves like conjunction. Right? So in some sense, we can think that our previous analysis of discourse, where the period was basically an and, was essentially saying that everything, the only discourse relation was a subordinating one. But now we see, oh, but there's more under the heavens than was dreamed of in our philosophy. Right? There's also these narrative relations. How should we deal with them? Well, sentences still sort of combine coordinatively, right? We're still saying and, but now we want to restrict the scope-taking possibilities here. Okay? And what we see is that we can't go down the left branch of a narrative relation, a coordinating relation. So we can just write that down. So a coordinating discourse relation, it takes its two dynamic sentences as arguments, and then it takes the future discourse, and we're not allowed to go. The second sentence is not able to look back in the first sentence for discourse reference possibilities, and neither is the upcoming discourse. Right? The upcoming discourse is only allowed to look inside of the second conjunct, not the left branch, only the right branch. Okay, that's being explicitly encoded here. Okay, so now we can subsume these different, more empirically rich discourse relations in this project. We can say, yes, here's how they influence the discourse referent accessibility of various sentences, and we're just going to directly encode that in their denotation, in the updated meaning that we assigned to them. Okay. All right. So what we did here is we studied the logic of the discourse, of scope, independently of studying how context sensitivity works, without even looking at how pronouns work. There was nary an analysis of pronouns. We motivated the logic of discourse on the basis of when pronouns could pick up a reference. But we didn't talk about how pronouns work at all. Okay. So now we're going to turn to that. Okay. Now we're going to turn to how pronouns work. Oops. Now we're going to turn to how pronouns work. So pronouns, so I'm going to go again through an overview. I'm going to talk about different theories of pronouns, and then I'm going to give a synthesis of these theories of pronouns. And then we're going to modularize context sensitivity, how pronouns work, and we'll talk about what contexts might be. Okay, so now we want to study context sensitivity independently of discourse dynamics. Why might we want to do this? Well, because, there's context sensitivity even if we don't have any specially dynamic things, right? I can have pronouns in sentences that don't have anything interesting in terms of dynamics going on, right? John loves himself. Mary said that Bill loves her, right? I mean, hey, there's a pronoun. Great. Wow. Context sensitive, but there's no dynamics. Okay. So I can study dynamics independently of context sensitivity, and I can study context sensitivity independently of dynamics. But of course, we're really interested in putting them together because they interact when they're together. But we can study them and model them in a simpler setting. Okay, so what does actually a pronoun mean? Now we got to figure out what pronouns mean. There are a couple of different analyses. So there's a variable analysis. We can say, yeah, he is just a pronoun. And this is sort of nice because we're essentially saying that pronouns are just bound variables, and that's how they co-vary with things like universals. Every boy loves his mother. What's going on there? Well, it's the same as for all x. If x is a boy, then x loves x's mother. Right? So straightforward. That's one analysis. Another analysis is that pronouns are identity functions. So this takes a little bit of insight and skill to get to work, but you can get it to work. And then a third option that some people propose is that pronouns are really hidden definite descriptions. So even though we say he, we really mean something like the boy near Kim. And sometimes it really seems like that's what's going on. Yeah. So, but these are three different possibilities, three different proposals that people have made in seriousness, and we're going to look at them briefly. They look very different, but it turns out, I think, that they're the same. And this was what I think of as one of the many brilliant insights of Philippe de Groote. So I think that all theories agree in the main respects. And there's a quote from a draft of a book of Pauline Jacobson's that I think, when I got the actual book, I couldn't find this there anymore. So I think it was just in the draft, but I'm still attributing it to her. She said that the first thought that a completely semantically naive person might have is that a pronoun just picks out, in a discourse context, some contextually salient individual. Okay? And then in the draft, she went on to say, and this doesn't work. But I want to say, yes, that is exactly right. That's exactly what's going on. In all three of these theories, that is exactly what's happening. And the only differences between these three theories is that they disagree in, first, what contexts are, and second, what it means to pick out an individual, or how you pick out an individual. But other than that, the three theories are the same. And they're exactly what's going on here. They're just picking out, in a context, an individual. That's all they're doing, all three of them. So, in order to motivate this to you, I need to describe these analyses, these theories, and I'm going to then explain why I'm claiming that they all instantiate this general vision. And then I'll present the synthesis. Okay. So, pronouns as variables. What's the idea when a pronoun is a variable? Well, that means that the meaning of a pronoun, he, is going to be a variable. So this is strange already, because variables are not necessarily the kinds of things that you would want to say are meanings, right? Variables seem like syntax, but meanings are not syntax. Meaning representations are syntax, but is a meaning the same thing as a meaning representation? Okay, and what does a variable mean in isolation? Oh gosh. Well, so let's put that aside for now, and let's go on. There are infinitely many variables, right? In a logic, you usually have infinitely many variables. And so pronouns, each pronoun in natural language is infinitely many ways ambiguous. Right? If I say he, maybe I'm talking about x1, maybe I'm talking about x2, maybe x17. I don't know. Infinitely many ways ambiguous. Okay. One option is to push the ambiguity into the lexicon and say, no, it's not infinitely many ways ambiguous. We just have, either infinitely many lexical entries, or the lexical entry for a pronoun is systematically more complex than you think, and we're actually, if the lexical entry for he means something like x0, and in order to go up to x1, x2, x3, I have to have an empty head, a silent head that I attach. And so to have x27, I need 27 silent heads on top of my he. I could do that. Okay. But the fact remains that for the processor, if I hear he, I don't know which one I'm talking about. Okay. So pronoun resolution is choosing the right one. The processor needs to figure out, okay, here are all these options, which one do I want to use? And syntax doesn't give you any help, because syntactically, all these different pronouns behave exactly the same. Okay. So syntax says, yes, these different variables, I don't care, there's just a he, and yeah, you figured out, processor. Okay, so now I said denoting a variable. What pronouns denote variables? What does that even mean? Well, luckily we have the lambda calculus, and we know what the lambda calculus means. So in a model of the lambda calculus, right here I'm using a sort of set theoretic model of the lambda calculus, we have three clauses, depending as whether we're looking at variables, applications, or abstractions. If we're looking at an abstraction, well, that's a function. We say it's a function from contexts to the meaning of m in that context, given as an argument the meaning of n in that context. Right? So we always have a context that's an argument to us. And the meaning of a variable is just a function from a context to whatever that context says the variable means. That's what the variable means in the lambda calculus. Okay? And lambda abstraction changes the context we're looking at. Okay? But a variable in the lambda calculus is interpreted as a function from a context to whatever the context says about that variable. Okay? Now, when we do linguistics or linguistic semantics, we usually have a superscript of our assignment function on our denotation brackets. And we say that the meaning of variable I with respect to the assignment function g is g sub I, whatever g says about x. Okay? But that parameter on the interpretation function is really just an argument. Right? So what that really means is just the meaning of xi is lambda g gi. And so a variable actually is a function from contexts to individuals. Okay? Now some people worry, oh, having pronouns denote variables, that's not compositional, that's not directly compositional because variables don't mean anything. Well, that's not quite true. Variables have a totally well-defined meaning. They're just functions from contexts to individuals. Okay, now, pronouns as identity functions. So how does this work? What's the idea here? Well, a pronoun he denotes the identity function. This is great, right? Because there are infinitely many variables, but there's only one identity function. So he isn't ambiguous. It's just the one thing. But in order to get this thing to work, you have to assign a different structure to every possible pronoun antecedent configuration, a different syntactic structure. Syntax needs to keep track of where pronouns are and how many of them you have, and which pronoun is being bound by which thing at every time. Okay. So syntax completely determines reference. So in the sentence, John said that Bill likes his mother, his can either be bound by Bill, it can be bound by John, or it can be free. Each of those readings has its own unique syntactic structure. Okay? So that means that pronoun resolution in this kind of theory is figuring out the right syntactic structure. Okay. In pronouns as variables, pronoun resolution was figuring out the right lexical entry. When pronouns are identity functions, it's figuring out the right syntactic structure. Okay. How does this work semantically? Well, luckily we can turn to the lambda calculus again. The lambda calculus is perhaps the best thing ever created, culmination of man's intellectual pursuits, and there are also resource-sensitive lambda calculi. And here, a variable just denotes the identity function. And if we are trying to interpret an application, for instance, in a context, well, we do that by splitting up that context and giving half to the functor and half to the argument. Okay? That's just how we do it. Okay. So again, here, pronouns denote identity functions. We know how to do this. Okay, well, what about identity functions and variables? Well, what's the relation here? Well, both require sentences to be interpreted with respect to a sequence of individuals. And this sequence of individuals represents the context in which we uttered the sentence. Okay. But of course, sequences of individuals or assignment functions are not really good representations of context, right? So, hey, what's the representation of the context we're in right now as a sequence of individuals? I have no idea, right? I mean, I don't know. It's not a good representation of context. It's not obvious how to have an assignment function or a sequence of individuals represent any given context. Okay. Maybe we can do it, but it's not clear. Okay. All right. So a variable, if our pronouns denote variables, then our contexts are infinite sequences of individuals. If our pronouns represent identity functions, then our contexts are all finite sequences of individuals, but the pronouns are partial functions. They're only defined on sequences of length 1. Okay. All right. Now, pronouns, the way they need to work, they need to, in a context, pick out some individual. We need to resolve them. Okay. But both of these strategies, the pronoun as an identity function and a pronoun as a variable, are really bad strategies, right? So if a pronoun is a variable, he 7, the strategy is pick the 7th thing in the context. What a crappy strategy. That's really a bad strategy in general, I think. If our pronoun is the identity function, it's pick the only thing in the context. I mean, that's a great strategy, but we have to figure out the right context first. Okay, so pronouns as identity functions, pronouns as variables, they all have the same idea. They're picking individuals from contexts, but the representation of context is poor. And the way they decide to resolve pronouns, resolve reference, pick the individual that they're talking about in the context is totally hokey. Okay? So they're bad approaches to the meaning of pronouns. Another approach is treating a pronoun as sort of a definite description. There are various incarnations of this depending on whether we think pronouns are actual syntactic definite descriptions or whether they just have the same meaning as a definite description. What people who advocate for this say is that they talk about minimal situations, because often we need to have situations that are very, very fine-grained. So Paul Elborn, one of the prominent advocates of this position, says essentially that the meaning of it is a function from a situation, and it talks about the unique individual in that situation. Okay, a minimal situation. Okay, and again, right here, a situation is a context. The situation represents a context. And it seems like that's a better representation of a context than just a list of individuals, but it's not quite clear what a situation is. Maybe a situation is really just a context of length 1. But luckily, we don't need to resolve this, right? Let's just hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and push it off onto someone else's shoulders. Okay? So what do all of these approaches have in common? Well, all of them say that a pronoun is a function from contexts to individuals. Right? A pronoun denotes a pronoun resolution algorithm. Okay? Now, what is this gamma here? Well, that's whatever a context is. That's the type of a context. What is a context? I don't know. We just saw all 3 theories here that I presented disagree. So who are we to arbitrarily decide this is the right way to go? Let's just look at what they have in common. They all agree pronouns denote algorithms for resolving reference in a context. We don't even need to say what contexts are. We don't even need to say which algorithms we're using. We just say that's what's going on. Computer scientists, psychologists, you guys, how do pronouns work? Let's ask them. Okay. We as linguists just say, once they figure out what pronoun resolution strategy people use, give it to us and we'll plug it in and we're gold. Okay. Now, I think this is useful to do because, first of all, it's what we've been doing all along. But we've made clear what we need to be committed to, that pronouns need context and then give you individuals back, and what we don't need to commit ourselves to. We don't need to say what a context is or how they do this. Okay? So, and there are in fact lots of different options. So a context could be an assignment function. It could just be a list of discourse reference. It could be a situation, a file card, a relational database of common assumptions. I like this one. It could be a pair of available discourse references and a modal base so that we can deal with modal subordination. Whatever you want a context to be, go for it. Okay? But they all need to be able to fit in this situation. Okay? So we need to be able to interact with context in a certain way. We need to be able to resolve reference in a context with this cell operation is what I call it. It's going to choose an individual given a context. And we need to update contexts with this upt operation here. It takes a context and an individual and it updates the context with that individual by introducing this discourse referent into the context. Okay. I'm going to use the letter G for contexts a lot, and writing lots of letters down is not my style. It fills up real estate on slides and it's hard to read. So I'm going to use G superscript X to mean G updated with X. Okay. So whatever theory of context is your favorite theory, all you need to do is say how you want to interact with it, and then we're good to go. Okay, so now we have talked about contexts. We've said, okay, I don't really know what they are, don't need to know what they are. We just need to be able to interact with them in a certain way. And this subsumes lots of theories of pronouns. Now we're ready to modularize context sensitivity. Okay. So what is the intuition that I want to cultivate here? Well, with respect to context sensitivity, when we make an analysis context sensitive, We just want to interpret everything in a context. Okay? So where we once had normal individuals, now we have individuals in a context. Where we once had normal propositions, now we have propositions in a context. Okay? So, again, we start out by talking about the exceptions, the things that are somehow intrinsically context sensitive that we couldn't really describe the meanings of before. Okay? Like he, or she, or it. Right? Pronouns. They're inherently context sensitive. Okay? So if we have an analysis with pronouns in it and we want to context sensitivize it, we should cry with joy because we didn't know what they meant before, because we can't talk about their meaning without talking about context sensitivity. So the meaning of he or she or it or whatever is going to be a function from a context to an individual. How do we get that individual? Well, you tell me. You told me how to resolve a context, how to get an individual out of a context. When you told me what contexts were, we used this cell operator. We'll use it here. That's what a pronoun means. Okay? So pronouns have to access the context. They use this cell operator. Determiners are inherently context sensitive because they update the context. The determiner will update its context. Okay? But all determiners do this. So the translation of a determiner is going to take a contextified property, a contextualized another property, the scope, the restrictor in the scope, and it's going to finally take a context, and it's going to construct a property, a normal property, out of the first contextified property, and a normal property out of the second contextified property. But it's going to give both context-sensitive properties the updated context, and context updated with the variable that the determiner bound. Okay. So in both of these scope and restrictor arguments, a discourse referent is set up that's able to be accessed. Okay. All right. So that is our exceptional thing. Our context homomorphism is going to replace he with the selector function, replace determiners with this ungodly monstrosity that really all it's doing is updating the context in both restrictor and scope arguments. And on anything else, on any other constant, it's going to systematically make it context sensitive, so it fits together with these guys. Okay? But it's not just going to make it context sensitive. First, we have to turn it into something that wants an argument at all. This capital K is the K combinator that takes an argument and throws it away. Okay? It says, give me a dummy argument, I don't care what it is. Okay? Why do we not care what it is? Because this K here isn't context sensitive. He doesn't really want an argument, right? But he's got to take one because he's expected to. But he doesn't know what to do with it, so he just throws it away. Okay, he says, okay, great. I need to take an argument. Sure. When I get it, I'll just throw it away, but then I'll have taken an argument. Okay, and then we can make that thing context sensitive. And we do it like this. So something that's not really context sensitive, something that's context insensitive, we can make context sensitive in a predictable way. And really we just do it, the only thing that's interesting here is we do it by threading the context through to the function that we have and to the argument that we give it. Okay. If we have an insensitive function and we want to make it a context sensitive thing, we just need to thread the context to all of its arguments. That's really what's happening. Okay. And likewise, if we have a non-context, if we have a context sensitive thing and we want to undo the context sensitivity, well, then we're just going to give it an argument back. We're just going to say, okay, well, I'm going to turn it to something that doesn't really want to be context sensitive, but it's still going to want an argument, but it might just throw it away. Okay. This works. It's not so obvious how to explain it other than mechanically. There's no real deep intuition here because context sensitivity isn't affecting any type in an interesting way, right? With dynamicization, we did something to things of type T. We used conjunction and we gave it the truth value true, right? We can see an interplay here. Here with context, making non-context sensitive things context sensitive, all context sensitivization does is it passes contexts through the sentence so that things that actually want access to the context can have it. Okay. But the only things that actually want access to the context are pronouns and determiners. Everything else, we just need to get it to pass the context to its neighbors. Okay? And that's what's happening here. Our function is we make him pass the context to his neighbors. Okay. So here's an example. Contextifying not takes a context-sensitive proposition, and it takes a context, and it just says, I don't care about the context, here, you take it. Praise, we want to make it context-sensitive. We give it two context-sensitive arguments and a context, and praise just passes the context down to both of his arguments. That's it. Okay. And every, if we were to make it context-sensitive without doing it in a special way, right? We were just to treat it as some random constant, it would differ from what we did actually, in that it would just pass the same context down to both its scope and restrictor arguments unmodified. Okay. The only difference between the meaning that we get, that we actually want for every, and this meaning here, is that in this meaning, the context was just given on to its arguments, but in the real meaning that we want to update the context. That's the only difference. Okay. So here's an example. Every boy's mother kissed. I see. Every boy kissed his mother. Sorry. So we might represent it like this. Here I'm using a very simple representation of the Saxon genitive. Instead of treating it as building a generalized quantifier, I'm just treating it as a glorified definite description operator. Okay. So apostrophe S is going to take a relation and an individual and give you an individual back. Okay. I would probably rather do it differently, but for the sake of this example, I'm just going to make it as simple as possible. So there are only two interesting things here. The determiner every and the pronoun he. Everything else is context insensitive. Okay. But we need to make the entire expression context sensitive because those two context sensitive guys are buried in it. Okay. When we make it context sensitive, we get this back. It looks almost exactly the same, but there are two differences. First, the pronoun he has been replaced by a selector function that takes a context as argument. Okay. Second, the context that it takes as its argument is not the original context that was given as argument to the sentence. This context has been updated with the variable bound by every boy. Okay? And this allows the selector function to actually pick that thing as its argument, as its choice as to what it refers to, which would in this case give us the bound reading of every boy loves his mother. Okay. So, my favorite analysis, my favorite theory about what a context is was Ekaterina Lebedeva's analysis. She was a doctoral student of Philippe de Groote, and she worked out a bunch of this stuff that I'm presenting here today. She worked out a beautiful simplification of de Groote's original proposal. And what I've done here today is essentially just factor it apart into a dynamic module and a context-sensitive module. She had lumped both of them together. But the main thrust of her work was, one main thrust of her work was to give a detailed working out of what a context might be. And her approach was to treat a context as a logical theory, which represents what the discourse participants actually believe. Okay? And so her selector function takes a property as its argument and a context and then gives you an individual back. And so what it does is it selects an individual that in the context has the property that you asked for. Okay? And the updating function takes a context and a proposition and gives you a new context. And it does that by conjoining the proposition with the context, which is the theory. Okay? So this is really neat because it lets us incorporate reasoning into pronoun resolution. Right? Because the pronoun resolves by finding an individual that the logical theory can prove has a certain property, that has a certain property according to the logical theory. So it doesn't have to just be an individual that we talked about that's right there in our list of whatever, in our list of discourse reference. It can be an individual that the context says has to exist. Okay. So here's an example. I bought a car, but the rear view mirror was broken. The rear view mirror, some theories of the meaning of the is that the referent of the has to be familiar. Okay. But in I bought a car, but the rear view mirror was broken, there is no, I haven't talked about a rear view mirror yet. But we know that cars have rear view mirrors. Okay? So in the context where I just talked about a car, now you know that your context is Greg has a car. But you also know lots of other things, like cars have rear view mirrors. And so when you use the rear view mirror, that's okay because you can reason, oh yes, aha, he has a car, cars have rear view mirrors, therefore his car has a rear view mirror, a unique rear view mirror. Okay. Similarly, paycheck pronouns, what's called paycheck pronouns. Every boy loves his mother, but every girl hates her. Hold on now. Her, who is her? Well, her mother, right? We can work this out in the same way. All right. So what I wanted to point out here is that we can study the logic of context sensitivity independently of dynamics. And now we can put it all together. Okay, so here's an example. A boy jumped and he laughed. We saw this before. If we apply first our dynamicization transformation, and then we contextualify that, we get what we want. We get the meaning of a boy laughed and a boy jumped and then he laughed is there is a boy, or it's a function from a discourse and a context to a truth value that is true just in case there is a boy, and there is a boy and someone laughed, and in the discourse, the discourse is true when it's given the updated context, which is not a very fluent way of describing what this means. But crucially here, the pronoun was translated into a selector function that takes the context updated with the variable bound by boy. Okay, so a boy jumped and he laughed. He laughed. If, depending on what the pronoun resolution algorithm does, it could give us back x. If it gives us back x, then we have a normal bound variable. Okay, so this approach allows us to continue having pronouns that are bound by something translate into variables that are bound. Okay. So here's a canonical, one of the classical sentences that got all of this dynamic stuff off the ground. If a farmer owns a donkey, he beats it. Okay. So this is a function. This is a dynamic and context-sensitive thing. It's a function from contexts and discourses to truth values. Okay. But we can ask what it means in isolation. What does it mean to ask what it means in isolation? Well, we talk about the empty context. We say it out of the blue, and there's just no more discourse, right? So the upcoming discourse is just going to take a context and throw it away and say true. Okay. What happens if we do that and we evaluate the meaning of this sentence, we dynamicize it, and we context sensitivize it, is we get something that's equivalent to this logical sentence. For all x and y, if x is a farmer, y is a donkey, and the farmer owns the donkey, then he beats it, where he needs to choose either x or y, and it needs to choose either x or y. Okay? Now, crucially, the for all x and y outscope the implication. They scope over it. So even though syntactically we have a farmer and a donkey inside the antecedent, definitely not syntactically outscoping anything. The dynamicization transformation restructures things so that the he beats it is actually in the scope of both indefinites, and they get semantically equated with universals. Okay. That's what ends up happening. They get turned into universals because the if then gets turned into something that is a negation, not A and not B. And this outermost not essentially turns the indefinite a farmer and a donkey into the universals. That's sort of what's going on. Okay. If now there's also the relative clause donkeys, right? A farmer who owns a donkey beats it. If again we utter this out of the blue, or in the null context, what I call it, in isolation, then this means something different, right? Because there's a relative clause here as opposed to something else. This translates into the following. For all x, if there is a y such that x is a farmer, y is a donkey, and x owns y, then there is a y such that x is a farmer, y is a donkey, x owns y, and he beats it, where he could either be x or y and it could either be x or y. Okay. Now again, which one we're going to choose depends on what the actual pronoun resolution algorithm is and on what the actual representation of context is. Here I just did a list. Okay. But this also gives us the right meaning. Okay, so What ends up happening is the following. Dynamic semantics, dynamic phenomena, are the result of combining two logically independent semantic modules. Context sensitivity with its own internal logic, and discourse semantics with its own independent logic. When you combine them together on types, you get the following transformation. An individual gets mapped to a function from context to individuals, and a proposition gets mapped to this crazy thing, which is a modifier of a function from context to propositions. It takes a function from context to propositions and gives you the same kind of thing back. Okay. So this is the way that things get put together. Each piece can be studied in isolation, although, I mean, to be perfectly frank, what a monster that is. And this isn't even a very long sentence. Okay, we can study them in isolation, which is probably a good thing, because if you study them all together, it gets really complicated. Okay. So the modular approach allows us to really understand the logic and the structure of phenomena. In addition, it allows us to view the world as the interaction of simpler pieces. Okay. And ideally, we have this, but I didn't talk about this, with a proof that the transforming of what we had, the refinement of what we had before with our new module, preserves the semantics we had. Right? If I spent so much work dealing with scope and argument structure, and then you come along and say, hey, Greg, I just finished dynamicization. Oh my gosh, this is so great. Here, let me incorporate it into your theory. I really want some guarantee that that's not going to destroy everything I've done. And it doesn't. In this case, we can show that it doesn't. Right? Sentences that don't have any intrinsically context-sensitive or dynamic objects have the same meaning in isolation. Okay. So what I would like to say as well here is that the theory, so here I'm mixing Jerry Fodor and Pauline Jacobson, sort of the folk theory of in a pronoun just picks out a salient individual in a context. That actually might be right. I think that's what everyone does. It allows us to say exactly what's the domain of linguistics and what's the domain of psychology. Right? Linguistics needs to worry about about which things modify contexts, which things access contexts, how they're passed around. But then psychology or computer science needs to worry about what contexts are and how we actually interact with them. It's extensible and it's intuitive. Okay. One last quick jaunt, because it's getting late for me. You can pause this. Dynamic Montague grammar does something different. Dynamic Montague grammar looks very similar to what we have been doing with respect to context sensitivity. Right? We have a context, and truth values and individuals are parameterized by context, but truth values are parameterized by two contexts, the input context and the output context, because dynamic Montague grammar is a theory of context change. A sentence isn't a truth value or it doesn't have truth conditions, it's changing contexts. Okay. So how do we take things that are not intrinsically dynamic and turn them dynamic? Well, in this way. We do basically the same thing we did before. The only interesting part is the case of propositions. Now we take two contexts, an input and an output context. Now something that isn't context sensitive in this way doesn't want two, he only wants one. Because he's still dynamic, he still has pronouns. But he's not I'm sorry, he's so context sensitive, he still has pronouns, but he's not dynamic. So what he does is he says, okay, the second context, it should be the same as my first, right? In dynamic Montague grammar, this is called a test. He's a test, okay? He doesn't change the output. He just passes the input on through the output, okay? And if we have something in dynamic and we want to make it static, well, now it only gets one context. And so we say, and our proposition actually changes contexts. So if we only get one context and we have to say whether we're true or false, how do we do that? Well, the way you do it in dynamic Montague grammar is you say, well, if there is a context that I change this one into, then obviously I'm well formed and I make sense. And then I can be true or false. I'm true or false just in case there is a context I can change. I'm true, sorry, if there is a context that I change this one into. Okay. And we can dynamicize some static things and we get the meanings that we might want. Okay. Here are the exceptions. And needs to be given this meaning. Essentially, it's doing a relational composition of the two arguments. It's saying, okay, my first argument is going to change the context into K. My second argument is going to start out with K and it's going to change it to H, and I'm going to output H. So totally, I'm going to go from G to H. Existential quantification is going to take a property, two contexts, and change the first context by extending it with a variable. Okay. So this is really truly dynamic because it's really viewing things as changing contexts. Okay. But it's not obvious. I can't find any way of decomposing the dynamics from the context sensitivity. Right here, it seems that things are just necessarily together. Okay. Which I don't like. But on the other hand, the types are simpler here. Right? This is what we end up with. We just have two arguments of low type. In the system that I presented to you, we had two arguments. One was a context, but the other one was a function from context to truth values, which is more complicated. Okay. So dynamic Montague grammar is a simpler overall transformation, but the one that we ultimately presented was complicated, but made up of simpler parts. All right. And also, it was less dynamic in a sense. It was everything was static, and that we were just looking at propositions and truth values and truth conditions, and we just simply extended the notion of scope to sentences. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great day.